Welcome back. Today I'm just going to show you how to do a bound edge for a seam finishing technique. So I've been asked by a client to make a linen tailcoat, but usually I would line it, and he's asked for it to be unlined. Now I can't overlock it. I could overlock it or serge it, but then you would see the serging, and I think it would ruin the look of the coat because you'd see it in the inside of the tails. Traditionally, I think what would have happened is that their seams would have been turned over, because you can't leave it raw because it'll just fray. So what I think traditionally what they would do is press the seam open and then tuck that seam allowance behind and then whip stitch it down. Unfortunately, my client isn't paying me enough to do that. So my alternative is to do a bound edge to the seam. Okay, it's quite a tidy finish, and I think it would look best. I'm going to start with my side seams. This is my front. I've got two pieces here, and they are right sides together at the moment. So what I need to think about when you're doing it, because obviously you're going to construct it afterwards, is when you've got your seam allowance open, you want the nice side of the binding to be here. Okay, so basically you need to sew on the binding to the right side of the fabric. So I'm going to just keep those together for a second or for a moment, and I'm going to pin them together so that I know that my right sides are together, and then I'm going to open it out and use the one on the bottom first. And what I'm going to bind with is it's a lining fabric. It's a bit silky, soft and shiny. I've cut it on the bias so it's nice and stretchy. And you see that stretch to it, and that means that if I've got shapes to go round, like I have a little shape here, it will just sit in there nicely. Okay, it means it can bend, which is really useful when you're doing this kind of thing. So I'm going to lay it on like that, and obviously, as always, if you want to use pins, use pins. However, I'm going to do this just by holding it, and I'm going to use the width of my foot. Now, on a industrial machine, the width of the foot is narrower than a domestic machine. The seam allowance I've got on here is 3/4 of an inch, and I've put on, usually I only use half, but I've added a bit more on because of this finish. Okay, just so that it sits nicely. So using the width of my foot, or use a 1/2 centimetre seam allowance, I'm just going to sew the binding on to the right side of my fabric. And reverse at each end. And then I'm going to cut the binding. I'm going to cut it a little bit longer, and I can trim that down afterwards. And then what happens is I'm going to take it over to the iron, and I'm going to press it. And then I'm going to press it. All the seam allowance goes like that, all to one side. And then I'm going to press it so that it folds round, and using the edge of my fabric as a guide, I'm going to fold round so that it sits round like that. Okay, and then that should give me a nice neat binding like this. Okay, so bear with me while I go and press it. So I've ironed the binding, and I've ironed it or pressed it so that all the seam allowance goes over to the way that the fabric is lying. Okay, and then I've folded it round. The thing is that when you cut your binding, it needs to be so that it can do that seam allowance there, and then it's going to fold round. And what needs to happen is that it's going to lay flat on the inside, on the wrong side, because it won't be seen. And although this will fray, it won't fray a lot, especially when it's hidden behind seam allowance. But what you need it to be is long enough that when you machine it again here, and we're going to try and machine either in the ditch or just right on the edge here, that you're going to catch that in. Okay, so I'm going to do that now and show you what I mean. I'm going to try and do it so that I do the stitch in the ditch, which means that it's a hidden stitch. It basically means where you've joined two pieces of fabric that you, rather than doing a top stitch, you stitch through where you've machined before. And in this case, because it's all folded one way, I'm actually machining on the fabric, on the top cloth side, rather than on the binding. So if I slow down in speaking because I'm having to concentrate. There we go. Okay, and then do you see it's raw edge, but I've caught it here. Okay, and then on this side you can see the stitch line, but it's sat next to the binding rather than on it. You can make a feature if you're really neat at sewing. You can make a feature and actually sew on it on the edge if you want to, but I just like to try and get it so that it's not sat on the edge. Okay, and then I just did both sides, so I'm just going to do that one as well. It's flaring out a little bit more than it should. So and again, you can pin this if you want to. I find that it's probably better that you don't, because you're going to ruck it up by, if you put pins in, it usually creases the fabric. So I think you'd find it harder, to be honest. But that's entirely up to you. If you feel like you need to, maybe pin it in so that your pins are sat in going that way, so that the head is nearest you, so that when you get to your pin you can remove it and then keep going, and reverse at each end. And can you see it's only just caught it there? I'm very lucky, just caught it there, and then it's caught it all the way down, just in at the bottom there, but I think that'd be okay. So that's my two front side seams stitched. Okay, so I've sewn my side panel, and I've done the long curve seam that's going to join to the back, as well as the side seam. Haven't done the armhole, and I haven't done the hem yet, so I'll explain why in a moment. And I'm just going to join, so I've got two pieces like that, so they're my side panels, and as you can see, this is the wrong side with the raw edge of the binding showing, and then I've got my two front panels, and that's the side seam there. So I'm going to now put my side seams together, and because you haven't folded over anything here, so underneath that binding is the edge of the fabric, and as I said earlier, I've got 3/4 of an inch seam allowance, so I'm going to match that up. I'm going to trim off the any extra binding at the bottom, just so that I know where the edge of my actual fabric is, and then I'm just going to match up my side seams as I would do normally, and then I've got a 3/4 of an inch seam allowance, so I'm aiming for here, so just under 2 centimeters. So that's my 2 centimeter line on my machine, and this is what I wondered whether it would happen, is that I'm going to catch that binding in. I don't think it will matter too much, so let's just see. And as always, if you want to use pins, please do. There we go. So, and then I'll go and press this in a second, but what you'll see on the inside of the coat is basically that. Okay. If you're a bit more delicate than I am, you could make that binding ever so slightly narrower, but I'm a bit of a chunky monkey kind of girl, so but that it gives you a really nice finish inside a coat, especially if you don't want all your raw edges to be seen. And yes, there is a raw edge of this binding under here, but it's, as long as you press that well, it's not going to get irritated to actually fray. And the binding won't fray a huge amount anyway. It won't fray anywhere near as badly as the linen. Okay. What you have to think about is how you construct something. So I've done that side seam, and I've done this seam here because I know that I've got to attach that to another seam. I didn't do along the bottom because I'm going to join a facing onto the front, but also I don't want it to stop and start at that seam, so I'm going to bind that as one piece, because you don't want to have, I could have bound that piece separately from this piece, but then you'd end up with a big seam allowance mess here. So if, at least if I go use this, treat this as one seam, I'll then bind it as one piece. Okay. And with the armhole, once I've put the sleeve in, I'd actually do a proper bound edge, which means that all the seam allowance will be enclosed inside, rather than having the seam allowance showing like it is on the seam here. But when you do a proper bound edge, you enclose all your seam allowance. So you'd have to cut your binding ever so slightly wider so that it can fold round like this and then tuck underneath as well. Okay.